Africa. Although it's the poorest country, although it's the poorest continent on Earth, without it, one of the most important multi-billion-dollar companies wouldn't exist. Instagram Reels, aka my racism app. In all seriousness though, Africa has been plagued by poverty, wars, and civil unrest over the past 70 years because of improper decolonization efforts from the former great powers during the Cold War. In this scenario, we will discuss a timeline where this doesn't happen and the great powers decolonize Africa properly. Before we go all willy-nilly and attempt to divide Africa properly, we first have to set up the foundations that will lead to Africa being divided properly. In our timeline, the great powers of Europe lost their superpower status to America and the Soviet Union after World War II. Although the Americans and the Soviets had many differences in their ideologies, one thing that they did have in common was the hate for colonialism. So they started pressuring the former great powers to decolonize. In our timeline, this pressure led to all the colonial powers leaving the colonies without properly setting them up for independence. So in this scenario, we will need to have the USA and the USSR foresee that chaos would happen if the colonies are not properly decolonized, and then make the effort to work with each other as well as the former great powers and their colonies to ensure that the process goes smoothly and that proper countries will be formed instead of the mess we got in our timeline. During the process, we will need to first get all the colonial powers to figure out the major ethnic groups within their colonies so that they could then be divided into proper countries. And while that's happening, they will also be focusing on rebuilding the core European territories after the immediate aftermath in World War II. With that all out of the way, I do have to put a disclaimer that would be an impossible task for everyone to figure out what all the exact ethnic groups are and how to properly divide Africa, because honestly it's impossible for me to figure out exactly how to divide Africa, because no matter what, everyone would not be happy. This is mainly just a thought experiment of mine, so take the former great powers being able to figure out the borders that I'm about to show you with a grain of salt. For the sake of the scenario, we will assume that the great powers are able to successfully work together to divide and unite major portions of the land that will become proper nations with more natural, cultural, and geographic boundaries that would work to benefit all the African countries to help them become successful post-colonization. So with that all out of the way, let's start this scenario. First of all, we have the Caliphate Emirates of Arabia. This hypothetical union gained traction after World War II during the late 1940s to the 1960s and was a political and ideological effort to unify all the Arab countries into a single state or a closely integrated federation, which was driven by nationalism, anti-colonialism, and a desire for economic and military strength. There were some attempts of trying to make this union a reality, like the Arab Federation of Iraq and Jordan, the United Arab Republic, the North Yemen Egypt Syria Federation, and the Federation of Arab Republics. All of these attempts of uniting the Arab world ended up failing, mainly because all of the states were run by dictators who didn't want to give up power. But in this alternate universe, the former great powers will work together to unite their colonies and draw out the new borders for this union so that all of the majority Arab regions will become a part of this union. After Spain gets rid of its fascist rule, Spanish Morocco and the West Sahara will also be able to join, and they could gather support from the Saudis to overthrow the rulers so they can join the union, which will look something like this. As you can see, the Christians would not be happy. This will also take a few decades to form because they would have to draw out the new borders, unite the colonies into a state that they would jointly administrate until it gains independence, and then after, set up an Arab-style form of constitutional monarchy, which is kind of what is being attempted to be formed in Syria right now, but in a republic format. Instead of being under a monarch though, they would be under a caliph, which is kind of like a Muslim version of a monarchy in oversimplified terms. The great powers will also need to ensure that each of the emirates, which is another word for states for all you Americans watching this, or provinces for the fellow Canadians watching this, have a certain degree of autonomy similar to the amount the American states have. Next up, we have South Sudan. In our timeline, South Sudan didn't gain its independence from Sudan until 2011 after a long and bloody civil war, and is still unstable to this day because of the lasting impacts of the civil war. In this timeline, they would simply be created as a state that would gain independence from France instead of being a part of Sudan, so that way they wouldn't have to fight in a civil war against Sudan to gain its independence, so they would avoid the deaths of thousands of people and the devastation of its land. Over here in this north-central area of Africa, we will unify the non-Muslim parts of the Central African Republic, Cameroon, and Chad together because the remaining parts of the Central African Republic and Chad are landlocked and they'll be economically weaker because they will no longer have the Arab regions like in our timeline. But because in this timeline all of their Muslim regions are gone, there will no longer be any religious tension in this new country, and the remaining parts of the Central African Republic and Chad are no longer landlocked, so they will be much better off in this union economically and politically than they were in our timeline as independent countries. Just below this new country in the central west of Africa, we will unite Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Congo, and this exclave of Angola when Angola is busy fighting for its independence from fascist Portugal. This is because these regions are culturally similar to each other, with some ethnic groups being spread between each other, and along with that they would have isolated economies, but instead one bigger one, so they would all do much better theoretically than in our timeline. In West Africa, we will have this new country that would be formed from parts of Senegal that would be unified with Gabita and Guinea-Bissau because these regions are really small and are separated because of these regions being under different colonial powers and could be united into one slightly bigger state where they could benefit economically from each other theoretically because of better port access. Next, right below this new country, we have the non-Arab parts of Mali uniting with Guyana so that Mali can gain access to the ocean, and also because it has lost most of itself, which is a good thing because right now that part of Mali has been trying to break away from Mali for years. However, in this timeline, they would have to unite with Guyana because if not, there would be a weak and small landlocked state. Moving to the east slightly, and we will also establish a West African coast union between the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Togo, and Benin. This is also mainly because of economical reasons, because they could theoretically be better in the union as opposed to being small independent states. For Sierra Leone, we will simply grant them independence just like in our timeline, as well as Madagascar and Nigeria. Moving on to the DRC, it is today one of, if not the most unstable African countries, which has been plagued by civil war due to ethnic divisions, foreign intervention by other countries like Rwanda, who is currently taking advantage of the situation, as well as being under dictatorships throughout its history. To combat this, we will take away some of its territory by giving away portions of its territory to neighboring countries who have more in common with some regions outside of the DRC than they do with other regions inside the DRC, like how the Kantaga regions have more similarities with Zimbabwe compared to the rest of the DRC, like a shared mining industry, and should therefore unite with Zimbabwe instead of staying with the DRC. There is also the Kasai region that should unify with Angola due to their cultural and ethnic ties. Then there's the Kivu region, which can be unified with Rwanda and Burundi because they all are ethnically similar to each other and also have closely connected trade routes. Last of all, for the DRC, the rest of it will gain independence as one state that will adopt a federal decentralized model so that the rest of the ethnic groups can be more autonomous from each other than in our timeline, so it will have a greater chance of success. As for Ethiopia, this one should be obvious, but it will gain its independence from Italy after World War II because it was liberated by the Allies. However, unlike in our timeline, it will not gain Eritrea, which will go to the Arab Union to connect it to its Somali region, despite it not actually being Arab. Speaking of Somalia, Kenya has a significant portion of Somalis in its northeast, which can be given to the Arab Union. Kenya can be further divided by giving the Lu region to Uganda, because in Uganda there are a lot of Lu-speaking groups that can also be part of one region in Uganda, instead of split like in our timeline. From there, the rest of Kenya can unify with Tanzania because Kenya would be much weaker without those territories, so a union between them could be mutually beneficial. Next, we will then have Malawi, who will merge with Greater Zambia because they share an ethnic group that was artificially split, as well as it being part of a much bigger economy. and Zambia will also gain access to this major lake, which shall not be named. And for the last of Britain's colonies, we will unite them all into a greater South African Federation that will give autonomy to all of its major minority groups and will be a regional power that will somewhat balance out the Arab Union, along with the greater Tanzanian country. Moving on to Portugal, and by 1974, it has abolished fascism along with Spain, which means that now Spanish Morocco and the Western Sahara will be integrated into the Arab Union. As for Mozambique, today there is a clear north-south divide that has caused a lot of problems in the country, with the north being much more wealthier, urbanized, and politically dominant compared to the southern region, which is much more poor and more rural compared to the north. Therefore, I propose that Mozambique shall be split along the Zambezi River between the greater South African country and the greater Tanzanian country, with the north going to Tanzania because it's much more culturally similar to Tanzania than southern Mozambique, and the south going to South Africa because it's more urbanized and similar to South Africa. As for the Kasai region, which would have been administrated separately from the DRC by this point, it could be unified with Angola before Angola gained independence from Portugal a year after fascism was abolished in Portugal, making Angola slightly bigger and much more border-girly than before. And with that concludes the division of Africa. Again, there are many different ways that could have divided Africa, and my way most likely isn't as perfect as it could be, but it is still much better in my opinion than in our timeline. This would be the division plan that I will say all the great powers agree on, and from there the proper decolonization of Africa would begin. During this process, the most interesting thing that would happen would be how the Cold War changes. In our timeline, since Africa wasn't decolonized properly, there were a lot of civil wars that the USA and the Soviets intervened on opposite sides from each other, and assuming the process goes smoothly, all of these civil wars will now be butterflied out in this timeline. Instead, what we could see is an alternate Cold War that has a much more prominent economic factor. In our timeline, the only time the Cold War was purely economic was at the beginning, when Europe was initially divided between the East and the West, and the USA and the Soviet Union used the Marshall Plan and the Comecon Plan to help rebuild Europe within their spheres of influence, to also get their sphere of influence on their side more. In this timeline, however, this economical aspect of the Cold War will expand into Africa, where the USA and the Soviet Union will use their individual economic plans to help rebuild Africa and try to get all the African countries within their sphere of influence. Instead of an arms race, we would see the capitalist and communist systems tested by providing money to all the new African countries while they're being formed, and after they're formed to try to sway them on one side or another. This would lead to way more investment into African industries, and will most likely see all the African countries form neutrality policies towards the Cold War over time so that they could receive economic guarantees from both powers. The only war I could see happening would be a civil war over Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, there's a significant Somali ethnic group in it that the Arab Union will most likely want to incorporate in the Somali region, and when signs of instability show in Ethiopia, they could take advantage of the situation and conquer those parts. If Ethiopia also gets Eritrea in this timeline like in our timeline, then the Arabs would most likely go for that region too to connect to its Somali parts. As time progresses, we could see the African countries become more independent and less economically reliant on other countries for foreign aid. If this aid is mainly directed at the three most powerful countries, which are the Caliphate Emirates of Arabia, Greater Tanzania, and Greater South Africa, then they could use their bolstered economies to benefit the rest of the African countries as well. From here, we could start to see spheres of influence start to show, with Arabia spreading more of its cultural and religious values to countries that in our timeline have significant Muslim populations as well as Arab minorities. As for Greater Tanzania, their sphere of influence would most likely be what comprises of the countries that want to form the East African Federation, like in our timeline, as well as a couple other additional countries which could later on form a single country like they are attempting to do in our timeline. And for South Africa, I could see them being a looser ally to Tanzania because of the mutual opposition towards the Arab Federation, along with Angola and Madagascar. Fast forward into the early 2000s, and by now the USSR has collapsed, just like in our timeline, and the post-Soviet states will most likely be in even worse economic positions afterwards because of the economic burden the Soviets carried when they were building up the newly independent African countries during the Cold War. As for the War on Terror, which started after 9/11, it would play out much differently because of the complicated network of terrorist organizations that exist in our timeline. Wouldn't be nearly as big because Africa is way more stable than it currently is in our timeline, which would lead to a lot of those terrorist organizations not to form. This means that with these terrorist organizations not being able to form, none of the radical ideologies will spread to other people, meaning that the Taliban could possibly not even have much power in Afghanistan or even become prominent. And if they do somehow become very prominent, they would be much weaker in our timeline, meaning they wouldn't be able to carry out 9/11 even if they wanted to in this timeline, meaning no war on terror. What we could see instead is the Arab Union invading Iran. In our timeline, Saudi Arabia and Iran do not like each other due to religious tensions among a lot of other issues that would most likely still be prominent between the Arab Union and Iran, which could lead to a war between them. This war would start with the Arabs making naval landings on Iran's coast. From there they could get Turkey and Azerbaijan involved in the war to claim the Turkish parts of Iran. In the peace treaty, the Arab Union could annex the Kurdish portions and the Arab portions of Iran, and Azerbaijan could unite with the Azerbaijani parts of Iran. Since Azerbaijan and Turkey will now share a proper border with each other, they could then unite at a later date. From there, a war between Armenia and Turkey could theoretically also happen because of disputes and tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan that Turkey would then inherit, which will result in Armenia being annexed by Turkey. Moving on to Europe, and by this point, we can start to see an alliance form between all the European and Asian countries that have more semi-authoritarian types of government compared to the rest, which most important of all would be the Arabs and the Russians who would form an alliance against the Western world over time. When the invasion of Ukraine happens in 2022 like in our timeline, the Russians could win, unlike in our timeline, because of the Arabs' military culture. They would have a more powerful military, meaning they could have bolstered Russia's military over time, making them powerful enough to successfully conquer Ukraine, along with Georgia and Moldova. If not, they could supply Russia with weapons and even join in on the war so that Russia can conquer Ukraine. From there, they can then unify with all of their puppet countries, making Russia much bigger and stronger than in our timeline. Now in 2025, world tension would be at an all-time high. With Trump's accession to power, the US moves towards the expansionist Eastern Bloc because of Trump's claims over North America. Along with Trump's isolationist plans, the US will no longer be preventing tensions boiling over between North and South Africa, with the Eastern Bloc having Turkish claims on Cyprus, Serbia's desire to reunify Yugoslavia, along with achieving Yugoslavia's irredentist plans, Turkish claims over the Greek islands, Hungary's claims over some of its former territory, the Arab Union's historical claims over the Iberian Peninsula, and even Rome, and Russian claims over the Baltics, and what they believe to be the rightful sphere of influence in Europe. The world is now on the brink of World War III, and that is where we'll end the scenario for now. Thank you for watching the video. When I was working on my what if everything went perfect for the USA video, this topic was something that I wanted to discuss in the video, and I realized that it deserves a video of its own. That, and I'm not so sure if I would like to make that video due to the recent political events between America and my country Canada, along with the rest of the world, which I'll be talking about in my next video. We'll be talking about the Canadian election coming up and the future of Canada from there. I'll need to get that video up before the election, which is just a couple of weeks away, so I've got a lot of work to do. I will be replacing the what if everything went perfect for America video with China instead. Isn't that just ironic? Before that, I'll have to do the what if the Wagner Rebellion was successful video because that's been on my list for a while that I haven't gotten to. Anyways, that's all for this video. Don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot, and I'll see you all in election season.